SACNAS is an organization that I have deeply admired and respected for its long work in our community, advancing our communities in science representation and working at the intersection of all of these issues for so long with such passion. So it's a great pleasure and an honor. And I just want to also put in a quick word of congratulations to Marcela and Yolanda in their work in advocating for you. We sometimes don't realize how important it is to have these champions at institutions that will go to bat for us and open doors so that we can do good work, so that we are heard, so that we have a voice. So congratulations and thank you for having the back of all of these amazing students. So with that, I am going to spend the next about, I don't know, 45 minutes with you talking about my trajectory in science. As you heard, my career has been really focused on science policy throughout. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to that, my journey, and tell you, where I am today, and what my hopes are for you, for our community, as we tackle some big challenges in front of us that can only be solved by science. And so I'm hoping that you are the future to a lot of those challenges that we need to confront in the endeavors and how you choose to use your scientific and engineering expertise. I'm thrilled that we have SHPE here along with SACNAS in this room, really emphasizing the point that we need to do this work together of the innovation, the discovery, the solutions that we need for facing these grand challenges of our time. And it can only be done if we work together, all hands on deck across our fields. And so maybe I'll start with telling you a little bit about how I came to science and to policy, and how I made those decisions along the way. I get a lot of questions about, well, you were in academia getting your PhD, and how did you make that transition to policy? And was that easy? So let's go back a little bit to where I discovered my love for science, which, like many of you, there was probably a moment where you realized that science, technology, engineering was your thing. And it was what moved you. And it was how you wanted to contribute. And for me, that's been a very much a defining driver. It is my passion for science, but how science serves society, how we use it to face and solve some of our biggest challenges, and how that directly can transform people's lives. And that is very much what drives me, and kind of what you will see as the common theme through this. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I went to the University of Puerto Rico, and there I had the fortune of being invited to do research in a lab as an undergraduate research. And I had a project there. I had my own undergraduate research project. I had the fortune that there were many research questions the group wanted answered, and there were many of us that were lucky enough to have the opportunity through NSF funding for undergrad research experiences to be part of a group's project. And I led my own work stream within that, alongside with taking all my classes and doing all the things. It was really interesting because we all had to do a lot as undergrads. And at the University of Puerto Rico, there weren't undergrads that only washed glassware for the researchers. Everybody had a project. Everybody had to do a lot. Everybody had to write. Everybody had to present, which meant that when I arrived in grad school and I immediately grabbed a pipette and started working on my experiments, there was a lot of shock. Nobody understood why I knew all these things and how do you know how to use a pipette? I was like, oh, well, back home, we don't have the luxury of having people that do things for us. I had to do it all And so speaks to a lot of the resilience that our communities experience. I like to say, todos hacemos de todo in the Latino community, right? Y that was my experience. That's how I arrived at grad school. But I arrived at science, I think my love for it and my passion for it, very much around middle school. I had the experience of visiting the Everglades, and I knew that I loved science, but I hadn't defined it as such. I couldn't articulate that this was the one thing that I wanted to do and do more of for a long time. And at that time in the 80s, the city of Miami and the county were pushing further into the Everglades, really impacting the ecosystem there, something that continues to happen, even though we have limits on that. There's always somebody trying to erode that boundary a little bit and build further in. And this, as you know, impacts habitats in tremendous ways, water resources. But it was the first time I really saw the connections between an ecosystem play out, between the humans that were right at the interface, the economic interests, and the delicate balance of the organisms that live there. And I remember that moment very clearly, when it all started to click and make a lot of sense for me. I decided that I was going to go to grad school instead of medical school, which was my initial thought when I was in undergrad. And I was just telling a group of your organization leaders that back home, if you're very argumentative, you're going to be a lawyer. If you're good at math, you're going to be an accountant. If you're into science, you're going to be in the medical field somehow. The paths are sort of very narrow and defined, and everybody sort of falls into those. And doing research completely blew my mind in terms of the horizons that I could reach for with science. I didn't know to the extent to which I would very creatively use my background as a scientist, but I knew that I wanted to do research because having research science as a tool could transform things. And I had the opportunity during grad school to get very involved in Boston with many things alongside my work as a graduate student. I became involved with community projects. For example, we created a summer camp for Latina girls in science. I became involved with campaigns that were supporting a candidate who back then had the idea of transforming a part of Boston into a big biotech corridor. I think that is very much a reality in Boston today. But back then it was very interesting to see how different leaders had different ideas of how to transform the city and the economy and to use as assets. So I knocked doors, I ran summer camps, I got very involved. And one of the things that I noticed was that I was seeing decisions being made in Washington that I didn't completely understand how they were coming to that decision. At that point in my research, I was doing a lot of work on developmental cell lines and trying to understand how a particular group of cells was developing and maturing into a final cell and what the decisions along the way were. It was farther in the development path than stem cells, but at the time there were being decisions made in Washington about which cell lines could be used in research. This was the early 2000s, and there were a lot of decisions being made about which cell lines could not be used that I didn't agree with. I didn't think they were science-based decisions, evidence-based. And I started to have that sort of yearning for understanding who was making decisions based on what, and how these decisions were impacting the science that was being done in research labs, and how it was trickling down to what a scientist ended up being able to do or not at the bench. And so I was that person that was saying, but who decided this? And that was my first foray into understanding that there was this whole field of work called science policy that integrated scientific expertise into the decision-making process. My PI was the one that alerted me to the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which was how I made the transition from my PhD in research to Washington to work in a government agency as a science advisor to a team. My first projects at the time that I did were in Muslim world outreach through STEM. And it was the final years of the Bush administration. There, we still had a lot of interest post-Iraq war, where we had a lot of engagement in majority Muslim countries. And we had projects in schools where we worked with departments of education and education ministries to bring experiential learning into classrooms and ensure that we were contributing to analytical thinking of the students, of the young women in these countries. And it was really exciting. And I would take Arabic lessons at 7 a.m. every day so that when I traveled there, I could converse in the simplest of ways. And it was a life-altering experience for me. From that position, I then transitioned to be the Science and Environment Officer for Western Hemisphere, which encompasses all of the Western Hemisphere from Canada to the tip of South America. And I was able to create the first strategy for science and environment engagement that the Bureau of Latin America used in its strategic planning during that time. And my position was initially intended to be a temporary position, but I was able to bring value in bringing science into the discourse about strategies, foreign policy strategies in the region. And my position was converted into a permanent position. And that position still exists in that bureau that handles Latin America. So just, I'm mentioning these things as I'm going through my talk to highlight the points at which I had the opportunity to change the system in some way in favor of more openness to evidence-based decision-making. It was not as important as that I be there for that time as it was that I was there. I created something and I left something that remained in that position. I then was recruited to become the Deputy Science Advisor to the Secretary. So I served both Secretary Hillary Clinton and then Secretary John Kerry in their capacities as Secretaries of State. And was able to lead that office with a very able team of scientists, the Science Advisors team, where we worked on numerous issues, including harnessing the power of diasporas here in the United States from different groups to help us make better decisions infused with science in their countries of origin. And we call that project the Networks of Diasporas in Engineering and Science. And that's my nod to SHPE. Because we very much realize the importance of bringing together science, engineering, and technology to addressing these challenges. I was confronted then in 2016, in late 2016, with the change in administration, with the decision of whether I would remain in government in my capacity or whether I would choose a different path. And I chose at the end of that year to leave the federal government and take my skill set elsewhere. And that elsewhere was I moved to South Florida to get directly involved in climate change justice issues down here. And right now I am calling you from Miami, from my house in Miami, even though I work out of Washington, D.C. a good deal of the time. I am here now. And my purpose in doing that was that I understood at the time that not only did I feel that my values did not align with the incoming administration, but there was a lot of very hard work that needed to be done to confront the challenge of climate change, and that the place where that work was likely going to have the most traction and impact would be at the local level. So I took all of my learnings and all of my lessons from working in the federal government and set off to try to apply those understandings to a local community making climate change decisions that would hopefully help how they faced, adapted, and confronted the challenges of climate change, which in this particular community of South Florida are very much what people call ground zero for climate impacts in the country. In South Florida, we have sunny day flooding. We have a porous limestone bedrock where sea level rise, the water comes up very naturally through our very foundation. We're in the path of all the hurricanes that come through the Atlantic. And we're blessed with lots of sun that unfortunately the state does not use as a source of energy, but that will, along with all the other climate impacts, be the source for extreme heat waves in the years to come. And so this was a place that the decisions that the community made, the decisions that the city and the state made would have a direct impact on everybody and might have a direct impact on the most vulnerable that would be impacted in the front line of climate. So I set off to work with local organizations as they sought to request and demand better decision-making based on evidence and science that would really help them prepare and adapt to the impacts of climate that we were already feeling and that are coming in the near future, as you all know. I then, in that process of coming to South Florida and getting involved very directly in climate justice issues, one of the things that I realized was that one of the ways in which I could be most helpful was that I really understood and had worked at that intersection of scientists working on the problems and the challenges directly through their research and field work, but also of the decision makers that needed to better understand the science, have that science translated in a way that they could use it to make better decisions for people. So that was a space I had inhabited back in Washington. It was the space that I was inhabiting here in South Florida. I came to understand not only the importance of having data information and science informed decisions, but I came to understand the importance of understanding the levers of power and where and how decisions are made and who holds the power and how you can influence that decision for the well-being and betterment of American lives. It's not a simple task, but understanding how decisions are made was a key skill that organizations on the ground needed in order to have that science be useful to the right decision makers at the right time through the right processes, and have sort of that bridge building between the policy and the science and the engineering come together. It's been a great pleasure to work out of South Florida and apply my science policy expertise here, not only because I believe that science is a tool for improving the condition of our communities, but because I was able to do it in a majority Hispanic community, where I was able to use my language and I was able to work on the ground in a community that I very much wanted to see do well. And I decided that I not only needed to work with organizations and with the local governments, but that I needed to work on the communications front. And I became an avid participant in TV and radio in Spanish language before the pandemic struck, speaking on issues of climate change adaptation and mitigation, and how those issues were affecting people in their everyday lives here, from the natural disasters that they were being confronted with, to their property maybe losing value as the real risk of climate impacts became an issue that all of us had to deal with, from insurance companies to the planning and urban design folks in local government. It also became a way for me to speak directly to my community in their own language about the science that I wanted them to have in their hands, at their disposal, to make the best decisions for their own families. That became a large part of my work during the pandemic, explaining, as the CDC was informing the public, making sure that I was on the air with my community in their morning ride to work, from their homes during lockdown, as they had questions, as the vaccine was being worked on, as guidance changed en masse, as more information came at us than anybody could digest, to be there with my credentials as a scientist and in their language, to make sure that I was being a resource for them. And that if I looked back at my trajectory of having the fortune to have an education that was funded by taxpayers in this country, that entrusted me with the scientific endeavor, that I would be giving back to the community. I very, very, very strongly believe in the responsibility that scientists have, not only to do their science, but also to talk about their science, to communicate about their science, and to put their best information in the hands of those that need it. After the election results in November 2020, I was asked to join President Biden's transition team as a part of the science transition team, and helping prepare the president for what he was going to encounter when he came into office, and what issues should be at the forefront of his considerations. I got to inform on the state of affairs for international climate and science cooperation, and help shape those initial weeks and months to ensure that we were in the best position for a return of the US into the global scientific endeavor and into the global climate arena that we had exited for about 4 years. I subsequently have joined a think tank in Washington, a progressive leaning think tank called the Center for American Progress, where I am the senior director for international climate policy work. And our work is very much focused on informing the policy that the administration puts forward as pertains to our relationships with other countries on climate cooperation. So last year I attended the climate negotiations in Glasgow along with my colleagues. And we have the opportunity to bring people together from different countries for dialogues that inform, use evidence, use science, and use our understanding of economics and geopolitical affairs to inform the decisions that the US makes as a part of that global climate community. As Yolanda said, I have also been asked to join the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, better known as PCAST in the scientific community. And I am the first Hispanic woman to serve in that role. And I bring to that role my experience working in government for many years, over a decade, my experience working on the ground with communities on climate change action, my experience in around the world negotiating on scientific collaboration with other countries to help confront challenges together. All of my experiences are now coming together in what I bring to bear on the questions that the president has posed to this group. We are 29 scientists from across the country in different fields with different experiences, but we were chosen to help the president answer some key questions. I think the most salient for me being how to confront public health challenges in the future, not just pandemics, but really analyzing the fractures in our system that the pandemic exposed and how we address those and addressed the public health of our country and how to be better prepared for future crises. The other question that I'm very excited about to be answering together with my colleagues from PCAS is climate change solutions for the United States and the world. And within that, one of the questions that we are starting to consider is how to harmonize the ways in which the world measures carbon dioxide emissions, which you would think everybody uses the same method, but no. And it is extremely important that we come together and use the best available science to harmonize those processes around the world so we can all be speaking and from the same page and the same language. And finally, the competitiveness of the country. How does the United States maintain its role as a competitive nation on innovation and discovery as it moves forward with these many challenges? And that touches all of the topics that SACNAS really cares about in terms of diversity and inclusion and making opportunity available to all, which is something the president likes to mention quite a bit. When he thinks of the United States, the first word that comes to mind for him is opportunity. So with that, I would like to not actually go on and on and on. I'm talking because what I experienced in the hour before joining you was that the leaders of SACNAS and SHPE had wonderful questions, and some had thought about policy, some were thinking very much about the challenges that we are faced with. And I would much prefer to have a long conversation with all of you in the room and all of you online, about anything you'd like to know in science policy, in my trajectory. So I want to open the floor and make that available to you. And I don't know if I'm moderating the Q&A or if my friends are, but I think that we're transitioning then to that part in the panel and the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Colón, for that wonderful address. You probably don't see me right now, but I'm
okay.
Gabriel. It's okay. But so now we're gonna switch to the questions from the public. If you have any questions, the people that it's online, please write it in the chat. And but we can start from now. Questions from the public. If you have any.
So a few of us in the room work at the Bird Center that does work with climate resilience. And I wondered if there's some good examples you have of equitable ways to work with stakeholders around the country that you would point out you've seen in your career as good examples of how researchers and those of us that are working in research spaces interact equitably with communities to get solutions that can be positive and implement over the next few decades.
Hi, thank you so much for your question. Yeah, that's a very important question, which maybe goes more to the heart of how do we interact with communities as scientists to ensure that they have a voice. Did I get that correctly in the intention of your question? Is he nodding? Yes. Okay. Okay. You know, it's not easy, and in the process of bringing solutions to decision makers and the urgency of the moment, we sometimes feel like we can skip that step. But that is the one step that we can never skip. Not only because many times what we understand the solution to be, or what will work best for a community, may not be completely informed by the conditions of the community, and may not be something that works in its totality unless you consider information that you could only glean from those conversations in the community. So sometimes our processes for delivering resilience solutions may have to be a little bit longer than we would wish. As short as the time window is for action, which I recognize, I know we have a very short time frame in which we need to implement a lot of these solutions. But we sometimes skip over local knowledge that is integral to the design of resilience programs. We sometimes do not understand specific cultural aspects and conditions of the community that pertain to its particular history that should be taken into account. I can give you the example of here in Miami. For a long time, the community has been asking for more solutions to be able to deal with sea level rise and the water that will come in through our bay inevitably, and how that will affect infrastructure quite a bit. Infrastructure that's on the coastline, as you may imagine, from businesses to homes to roads and the like. And the Army Corps of Engineers came up with a solution for a wall that would be placed sort of in the middle of the bay at a certain point in the coast, in the city. And there were some consultations done with the community, and it came up through those consultations that that wall would only allow us to push against a particular level storm, a particularly aggressive storm that would bring storm surge with it, but that only one specific section of the city would be protected from that. Water would eventually, make its way in through other places where you weren't walled off. And that those places where the water would come in maybe were not as high net worth assets as the parts that would be protected directly by the wall. And so some inequality in the design started to surface in terms of how we thought about what we had to protect, what we had the money to protect, and what should be protected first. And then homeowners started arriving at the table and saying, well, wait a minute, where is this wall going to be placed? And how is it going to affect my access to the bay? And how will that be different from other people's access to the bay and its views? And as more and more of our community leaders and members and organizations and students and business owners and homeowners started to understand the impact of the project started to morph and change. And the request for living shorelines of mangroves that could do the work of absorbing the shock of storm surge started to be incorporated into the design. But even as that process, the many iterations of this project were influenced by those many interactions with the community, the project changed and went through many versions. And eventually, because the Army Corps puts in a portion of the money, but then the county has to match and put forward the rest of the money. Then we came to realize that this wouldn't be built for another 20 years. And as you know, climate change has other timelines in mind. We came to realize that we hadn't considered the economic impacts. We came to realize that there were so many voices that had been left out. But then the pressure of making a quick decision, because we needed to decide now to get this in order, to get the money allocated by Congress so that this could be done and started 10 years from now. Eventually, the decision was made to back away from the project. And this is just an example. But it took us months and months and months of back and forth conversations, community outreach, engagement, and in many of the flaws in the project, and how it would only help us tackle one aspect of climate change, only the storm surge from only Cat 4 or 5 hurricanes. Everything else was going to continue to flood through sunny day flooding. Everything else was sea level rise would continue to affect us. Every other climate impact was completely unaddressed in it. So it's just an example, but an example of how a project was iterated on with community feedback and eventually deemed to not be the best formulation of something that could address the needs of this community. We will be faced with that type of situation a lot in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Now I'm gonna read the question of former president of SACNAS chapter at OSU, Priscilla Rodriguez. Hello, Priscilla. Thanks for participating. So I'm reading. Great talk, Dr. Colón. I'm a senior graduate student, and one question incoming graduate students have is, how much would your research topic impact your options for future careers? How much did that impact your journey in science policy?
My specific research topic in grad school. Yes? Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. In my case, neurobiology, developmental neurobiology, which was the theme or the topic of my work, it has not been something that I have worked directly on in my policy work, but it certainly was the training that shaped my scientific thinking, my problem solving and analytical skills, right? So in terms of influencing policy and being able to translate science, the skills I draw from are the skills of a scientist that shaped a project, answered a question, was able to research information, was able to design and redesign and reroute as she set off on her research journey, of somebody that knows where to find the information and knows who to call, that developed partnerships to get her work done, right? So I think that more than the substance of the topic of my research, it was the training in problem solving, the passion for using information to make decisions and to iterate on a project and an idea that I have brought to the policy endeavor. And the same is true for many of my colleagues in science policy. We arrive at science policy with many different lines of expertise, and find that the needs of the government and the nation are great in many other areas where our transferable skill set can be deployed very well. And so I have ended up working on everything from scientific cooperation of diaspora communities, to explaining a particular topic of space to a decision maker and so forth. And what I bring is my background as a scientist.
Thank you very much. I will keep reading some questions. We have 4 more, I think. All right. So, we have these questions from Arisha Yayashinge. Sorry if I'm not reading quite well. Question is, coming from a science background, how easy was the transition to policy? Well, I think you kind of responded that. What challenges did you face when you started, and how did you overcome them, especially as a woman in STEM? What advice do you have for anyone who expects to transition to a non-academic career?
I think the value of the scientist is the problem-solving mindset that they bring to any of these topics and challenges in policy. I think one of the most challenging things was learning how to completely change the way I wrote for policymakers. You know, in science, we write lengthy papers where we describe every detail of our research and the results, and you know, we explain how we got there, we explain our rationale, we connect it to other research that's been done, and in the hopes of contributing a new discovery, a new line of thinking to a long body of work that many researchers before us have worked on. And so I had to learn how to be very brief and speak and write in terms that somebody without a science background could grasp the importance of the issue, what the problem was, and what we were solving for. So I learned to go from 30 pages to a page and a half. I learned how to incorporate other priorities and variables into consideration into my work. So many times science is a very, very important consideration in a decision that's being made, but most of the time it is not the only consideration. And so I had to find my voice in terms of how to frame issues so that I could place the importance of the scientific angle in terms of all the variables that are being considered before a decision is made, and be able to translate that into simple terms, into how it made sense within a political, economic, and social frame for a decision maker. And I think that that's maybe one of the most challenging things of changing how we think and how we present science to a very diverse and broad set of audiences when you're in policy.
Okay, thank you very much. We have at least a couple more questions, but we are going to delay them for the next part of this next portion of today's address, and we're going to start with the panel. So thank you very much, everybody, for your questions.